In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold.
Okay, so on the phone this evening we have a writer, a podcaster, a fan. All right, I'm shaking up.
The Abracast. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Everybody, it's John. A couple quick notes about this evening's show. I got a great one for you. Landed a great guest. Micah Hanks from the Micah Hanks Program is on the show this evening, and I was honored to have him. And also a little embarrassed because I've been doing more and more interviews. And I thought that my technology was up to snuff, but it shit the bed this evening. The interview is still very good. Micah sounds awesome. But I sound like garbage. So if you're like one of these extreme audiophiles and it might bother you, I apologize. It's still totally worth, experiencing the interview. With that being said, I don't want to get off onto a whole thing. With that being said, summon your vessel of the art. Help me and join me with thanking the Patreon and Subscribe Star supporters for this evening. Thank you guys. And I'm on top of this technology problem, believe me. So very special, just thanks to Micah. The guy's like a walking encyclopedia of all this Fortean stuff. So it's great. We hang in towards the end. We get into media gaslighting and fake news. It's something that we haven't talked about in quite a while, and Micah is right on top of it, just like he's on top of everything. So please indulge me. I beg for your forgiveness for this audio issue, and I might be making more of it than it really is. But I hope you guys enjoy the show. Let me know what you think, and check out Micah if you haven't. Thank you.
Phone this evening, we have Micah Hanks. He's a writer, a podcaster, a history fanatic, a science enthusiast, and a philosophy junkie. He is the mastermind behind the Micah Hanks Program. Micah, thank you so much for coming on the show this evening.
Well, it is my pleasure. And as we were wrapping a little before the show, I appreciate your approach and your the kind of content that you feature on your show. So yeah, I'm sure it'll be a great conversation.
Yeah, so I appreciate the way that you deal with the UFO topic. I know you describe yourself as hopefully skeptic, and I feel like I'm just a little bit more skeptical than that when it comes to this stuff. But so the reason I wanted to have you on, because I kind of painted myself into a corner with all this UFO stuff. After the Nimitz Incident footage started coming out, I decided that I was going to have to start paying more attention to it. And I started, a few months ago, I did an episode about Flying Saucers Are Real by Keogh. We talked about the Kenneth Arnold stuff and the mysterious death of Captain Mantell, that Mantell incident. Mm-hmm. And we kind of did like 2 or 3 shows at this point dissecting the work of Milton William Cooper. So I feel like I kind of framed the show by this the extraterrestrial hypothesis. That UFOs are piloted by space aliens, and I know that you have a lot to say about the theories and origins of the UFOs. So I was hoping that you might come on and talk about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the background that you're giving there with the episodes that you've covered, and delving into those topics, it's an interesting era that you're addressing because I would say, again, we'll get into all of this later, there was a real decided shift in attitudes about, well, if UFOs exist, in my opinion, again, if we're going to jump both of us onto that, semi-skeptical side of things, if there is a phenomenon, that's still part of the question too. But for those in the research community who had been dealing with it for about a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades, by the time the 60s rolled around, many people are saying, we've been looking at this. Our approach to studying this has not really yielded a whole lot of additional fruit. And, maybe we need to change our approach or consider other alternatives, including, what the origin of the phenomenon may even be. And so that's really the reason for having this discussion. And as you've probably covered in the episodes that you've done, a lot of the stigmas and attitudes that people still have to this day, John, about the UFO phenomenon, they really, I think, emanate from those early years in the 1940s and the 1950s. And really, someone you mentioned, Donald Keyhoe, he is kind of a central figure, arguably one of the most influential people to comment on this subject. But I don't know if all of the determinations and attitudes that he projected onto this are necessarily correct. He nonetheless was influential, but we're left to kind of have to deal with some of those stigmas. So yeah, one more reason I'm glad we're having this conversation.
So do you think a lot of this stuff started, I mean, obviously it didn't really start with Kenneth Arnold, like before them, before he did his sighting at Mount Rainier there, like there was in the pop culture, there was science fiction before that. Do you think that we're still kind of dealing with that sort of stigma of it being science fiction before, these legitimate sightings took place?
Yeah, I do. And, maybe to best answer that question, it would serve us well to look at, in addition to our discussion about the history of UFOs, it would do well, I think, to for us to jump back and consider what we might call the prehistory, or maybe the prelude, because many historians who have commented on this, and I should also outline here, one of the reasons that I've been looking recently and did a whole podcast on my own show about the theories of origin related to UFOs, it actually has to do with a broader, serious, scholarly attempt on my own part to look at the UFO phenomenon in a historical context and to understand a lot of things, including the development of beliefs and attitudes related to UFOs over time. And so, really to understand what UFOs, and you touch on this in your question, I love where you're coming from, because again, many commentators and especially skeptics have said, prior to 1947, there were comic books and there were sci-fi films that already were, kind of hammering us with that idea, the meme, if you will, of extraterrestrial visitation in mechanical spacecraft. So that idea existed before Kenneth Arnold saw whatever he did over Mount Rainier in 1947, right? And so, we have to acknowledge that the UFO idea, as far as extraterrestrial visitors in spacecraft, flying saucers or whatnot, that wasn't something new, and that wasn't something that arrived in 1947. There's definitely an existing idea that jumps over from science fiction, and probably that's really the beginning of where UFOs, as they come to be known in the public consciousness in the 1940s, right after the Second World War, that's really probably the beginning of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, because we are influenced by science fiction. And this goes back to the turn of the century, in fact. H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds. Incidentally, the first use in the English language of the term extraterrestrial, I believe it was hyphenated, and it was in reference not so much to the occupants, because keep in mind, in that story, they are extraterrestrial, but, part of what's happening is that they have, been burrowed underground and in hiding kind of in in a sort of hibernation state or suspended animation, and they are awakened. But that's one component of the story. But there is, of course, also the arrival of some extraterrestrial vessel, which a group of reporters that are gathering around this, they refer to it as such. And so it's in relation to the actual mechanical object in this crater that first use of that term appears. Now, I was interested in that, and I wanted to see if it had ever occurred earlier, and it seems that indeed, although I've had a little trouble tracking it down, that probably by the middle to late 19th century, there were some in the biological community who were using that term, because they began to speculate about things like, well, what would life on other planets look like? I mean, would it look like life on Earth? And one of the reasons for them asking that question had been the profound influence that Charles Darwin had on the scientific community with his theory of evolution. And, the way that this affects science, it was profound. And yes, it also got people thinking about, well, if evolution occurs and that is relative to life on Earth, how would life on other planets evolve? Would they be like us? And so, again, we have to kind of credit Darwin with helping in terms of shaping our attitudes about extraterrestrials. But now, to jump into that area of what I'm talking about in relation to, pre-ufology, I want to make a distinction between that and the idea of the origins of the ET concept, which we might say goes at least back to Darwin. But, again, this idea had sort of been percolating throughout the centuries, even before that. Theologians, and then eventually philosophers, and then eventually scientists gradually are kind of working on this idea until around the 20th century, and then it becomes something of a staple in science fiction, and scientists are looking at that possibility too. But in terms of pre-ufology, what's really interesting is that throughout the Middle Ages, we also had the occurrence of sightings of strange things in the skies. Terms for these included prodigies, portents, and the like, and often you see references, especially in literature, related to, alleged ancient astronauts and things, ancient alien enthusiasts. They love to look back at such things as the German woodcuttings depicting something occurring in the skies over Nuremberg, Germany, right?
Yeah.
Those are pretty famous.
Yeah, those were crazy.
Yeah, and a lot of people look at that and they say, well, these must be UFOs. Now, what we actually know from a scholarly perspective is that there are a lot of natural phenomena, perihelion, or sundogs. We have meteors. We have a lot of things that can probably account for the things that people were seeing in the skies, and they didn't really have a full knowledge of. What's significant about them is to understand that in the absence of knowing, natural or otherwise, the cause behind things that were seen in the sky, people nonetheless recorded these things. They found these things to be significant. Just like when we see things that we can't identify in the sky today, we find them to be significant, and we project a lot of things, a lot of beliefs onto them. And so I would argue that well in advance of 1947, and with Kenneth Arnold, there was this existing tradition, if you want to call it that, of people seeing things in the skies that they couldn't identify, and they project religious attitudes onto them, or they have expectations about, omens of ill fortune or maybe of good things, all different kinds of interpretations. And so there's a lot of scholarly literature that looks at even the political ramifications of the interest in these prodigies, these portents, these wonders in the sky, if you will, that appeared throughout time. But again, really, I think with the Enlightenment era and with the shift away from philosophy into natural philosophy and then into science after that, we began to really see that, our attitudes toward things that people see are beginning to change. Things are less theologically oriented, broadly speaking, and people are more inclined to look at things through the lens of science, or at very least what scientists are able to tell us about the things that we see. And so it's an interesting progression leading up to after the Second World War, when Kenneth Arnold sees, again, objects, flying in formation, he said, over Mount Rainier. And he didn't say they were alien spacecraft. He said, they were disc-like. He said that they moved sort of like a saucer skipping across the water. Then the press runs with that, and flying saucer becomes the new name for these things. Although he didn't say alien spacecraft right then. Interestingly, if you go back and look at the newspaper archives, as I do, I'm a old newspaper hound. I love digging through old newspaper archives. You'll notice that within just days, there were people in somewhat mocking editorials that were sort of making fun of the whole flying saucer thing. and they were immediately insinuating that these were extraterrestrial craft, albeit in a joking way. So even though Arnold himself didn't immediately jump on that, there were definitely people who were insinuating it. And I guess that in a very long story short kind of way brings us back up to the point of 1947 and the modern arrival of what we call UFOs.
Yeah. So, okay, I have a couple things to say. One is it's funny because the media has not changed that often or that much in this broad span of time, because I don't know, when the Malaysian jetliner disappeared, I remember someone on CNN asking, the possibility of alien involvement of a disappearing airplane. So it's you got that. And also, I just kind of wanted to brush back and touch on this thing that you were talking about, and I think that it's interesting, and I try to do this all the time on the show, where you have to put things in context. And what I mean in this instance is the cultural context. It's easy for us to look at the woodcut paintings over Nuremberg and be like, look, man, those are obviously flying saucers, where you're you don't know the zeitgeist of the time and the political ramifications of what's going on. And another thing that it made me think of is, when Constantine converted to Christianity, and he says that he saw this cross up in the sky that that caused him to change his mind or whatever. And obviously there's plenty of historians now that just says that that's just a load of BS for a reason, a political decision for him to rally Christians behind him or whatever. But I mean, the story is out there through that cultural context, and I think that's an important thing that we don't really look at anymore. We just see it and we're like, yeah, well, it's a weird light in the sky, and I know what I would think if I saw it. So I think it's interesting to couch it in that lens, the cultural context lens there.
Absolutely, yeah. And you point out some great things there when you mentioned Constantine. And again, there's a great book that people should read. There have been some criticisms of it, and there've also been some tremendous praise. The book is called Wonders in the Sky. It's by Jacques Vallée and Chris Albeck. And again, some of the criticism is both for the fact that there are some instances where some of the dates and things are a little loose in some of the entries. As my understanding of the project is, the co-authors, I believe, had wanted to try and do an updated, expanded, and corrected edition, and then put out a second edition in a limited printing. And so I think of that very much as not only the culmination of decades of research between these two researchers, Chris Albeck, and of course, Jacques Vallée, who to me is someone who's widely respected in the community. I too share that respect for him. But it's also very much kind of a living project in the sense that, an edition of the book came out, but with new information forthcoming, feedback from both, scholars and, people who are proponents of the idea that these ancient wonders are important, people who say those things are unrelated to UFOs completely. They're trying to broaden the narrative and update the discussion. But again, that's the primary criticism, I think, to that book, which was that, the nuts and bolts UFO crowd, they look at what's in that book and they're like, these aren't references to UFOs. These aren't flying saucers as we know them today. Flying saucers arrived after the Second World War because we started using nukes. I'm not saying this. I'm saying this is the attitude among many modern UFO researchers.
Right.
They would see this as a post-World War II response, perhaps, to our use of nuclear weapons, and it's a modern phenomena. And so, one of the biggest criticisms of that book has been, to us, this is not ufology. Now, let me be the apologist for that book, because I read the entire thing. I would say that there are maybe 15 to 20 entries of the 500 that the authors present that are really maybe worthy of serious consideration in relation to UFOs as we know it today, in our cultural context of today, like you were saying. But the reason I mention it here and recommend people read it is because I think many mistake that for being a book about UFOs, whereas I think that the authors, while, again, trying to lend to that broader discussion, they are intentionally, especially Vallée, he is trying to offer commentary on reports of religious visions, wonders in the sky, prodigies, and things along these lines from ancient times to the present, because rather than to say these were all flying saucers that people were seeing, I think that is the very simple and blasé interpretation, and hence a wrong one by many who've read the book. It's not that they're saying these were all flying saucers, but they were described as religious visions at that time. I think, to the contrary, Vallée especially is saying these were all experiences that people had from antiquity to the present day. They cut it off, I think, right at the beginning of the 19th century in the book, though, or up through it a little of the 19th century, but they cut it off before we get to the famous airship, waves of the late 19th century. But, Vallée's contention has always been there is a similarity between the ancient tradition of people looking up, seeing things in the sky that they can't understand, and then we project our own beliefs or values onto it, whether they be religious, scientific, occult, whatever. And we do that with UFOs too. We have not yet identified what the phenomenon is, but so many, despite that, take for granted, well, they must be ET. Well, they must be interdimensionals. Well, they must be our own stuff that we've cooked up over at Area 51. Vallée's trying to say that is part of the phenomenon, the human tendency to see things we can't understand, and then the phenomenon really more so is what we project onto it. What about that phenomenon that we can't understand causes us to jump to the conclusion of the otherworldly, the godlike or the interdimensional? So I think that that's part of what the authors are really trying to do with that book, which many people fail to recognize. And I think in this context, like you're saying, John, of understanding the culture of the era and people's beliefs and values and what's happening religiously, politically, etc., at that time, respective to that period, those things must be taken into consideration. But then we have to look at how we view the phenomenon today, without saying there's continuity between all of it, that we're all looking at flying saucers or that's what we believe they've been throughout time. We need to say, when we see things that are unusual, that we cannot explain, how do we understand the human side of this? And how can we rectify the fact that we as humans are still doing that today?
Yeah. So one of the things that I love to talk about on the show also is whenever you can run into these kind of topics and point to it and say, that's psychology,
Yes.
And that's kind of what you were just talking about. It's like, what is it about us that makes us go, what the shit is going on? Making us think that it's otherworldly is like the first thing that we go to. So I kind of mentioned at the beginning that this whole thing kind of got started because of the recent Nimitz, the Tic Tac videos and all of that. Do you believe that supports the extraterrestrial hypothesis, those crazy videos?
I don't believe anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but seriously, now I'm not trying to dodge your question. I think it's important to recognize that part of what we're discussing is people's tendency to say, I don't know what this is, but here's what I believe it is. The best I could say in relation to the Nimitz videos, and let's keep in mind, again, most people are up to speed on what we're talking about here, but there are 3 pieces of footage that have been released to the public. They appear to come from the U.S. Navy. They were captured utilizing instruments, including the Raytheon Company's Atflir pod system, which is utilized by the U.S. Navy on some of their fighter jets. And these videos, one of which has relation to a high-profile 2004 UFO incident that occurred with Carrier Strike Group 11 off the Southern California coast, popularly known as the USS Nimitz Incident. The video was not made at the time of the intercept, which was led by Captain Dave Commander Dave Fravor, actually, and his weapons officer. It was made afterward by another pilot named Chad Underwood, but it shows, and again, it leaves a lot to the imagination, but apparently after Fravor had been directed to engage this object, he and also the pilot of another aircraft, and it evades them and then returns to what they call their cap point. It was a very strange circumstance. These objects, I refrain from calling them aircraft because some of their behavioral faculties are a little beyond what we would recognize as aviation known to us here on Earth. So I say, rather than to call them aircraft or planes or anything like that, I would say they are objects and they appear to move through the air, right? But there were very anomalous characteristics described by the pilots. So again, most people know this. But about the videos, one of them, again, is related to and has to do with the object that was seen shortly after that famous intercept that is part of this broader discussion. The other two are unrelated to the Nimitz case, but they are nonetheless unidentified. What we do know about these, and the reason the Nimitz incident is so important, is because we have so much information. In fact, you probably know this, John. I've interviewed two of the participants who were actually with the strike group at that time, Petty Officer Jason, Gary Voorhees, I'm sorry, and then also Petty Officer Ryan Weigelt. Mr. Voorhees had actually been one of the radar technicians aboard the USS Princeton at that time, and he was also one of two who I've spoken with who has confirmed. I've also communicated with Kevin Day, but I haven't interviewed him formally like I did Weigelt and Voorhees, but Voorhees confirmed for me that there were two individuals with some government agency, possibly the Air Force, but they didn't know, who came on board and actually retrieved certain information about the incident in the form of data bricks pertaining to radar data collected by the Princeton. So, to your question, do I think that they prove or that they lend themselves to the idea that this is an extraterrestrial phenomenon? I don't think that there's enough information represented in those videos to make that determination. What we can discern is that the fact that the information was sensitive enough that some of it was retrieved, and we don't know what happened to that, as indicated to me by the former petty officers aforementioned, and the fact that there's been a lot of reporting on this by some friends of mine. One is a journalist by the name of Tim McMillan, who's written for Popular Mechanics about this. He's interviewed, to my knowledge, all of the witnesses, with the exception of pilot Chad Underwood. I don't think he's spoken with him. But what we have been able to infer, because Tim and I at least once a week talk about all of this, is that the flight characteristics of the object in that film related to that incident are unlike any kind of technology that we know to exist. Now, a skeptical interpretation, and it's fair to propose those because we need to apply skepticism to this. A skeptical interpretation has been that this was a 747 off in the distance or some other kind of prosaic aircraft. There's nothing unusual about this. Well, to the contrary, if it were any kind of conventional aircraft, there should have been very easily detected a transponder by a commercial aircraft, even at a distance like that. Radar operators on board the USS Princeton would have been able to easily discern this aircraft and distinguish it from anything with the anomalous characteristics that have been described by not one but many different individuals involved with that incident. Gary even told me, Gary Voorhees, that when they would track these things on radar, because there wasn't just one around the time of that intercept, there were many over the course of a couple of weeks. And he said it on a couple of occasions when we would get these anomalous traces on the radar. And by the way, this isn't a traditional radar. This is a pretty sophisticated system that's called the Spy 1 Bravo. This is a very advanced sort of radar system. And in fact, actually, if you look at photographs of the USS Princeton, which you can find on Wikipedia and other sites, there's a sort of a Pentagon-shaped pad on the front of the upper, I guess what you'd call, front portion of the air of the sailing vessel. And that is actually a component of the Spy 1 Bravo, as Mr. Voorhees explained to me. And he says it doesn't, sweep like a traditional radar. It kind of goes out in all directions all at once. So it's really sophisticated stuff. And so we can say that this is actually better capable of tracking and discerning information about anomalous characteristics of aircraft or objects like those we're discussing here. But he said on a few occasions when they would get these traces, John, that he would run up the top deck with binoculars and actually look out over the horizon. And especially at night, he said that he would see an almost sort of phosphorescent kind of light moving. It wasn't, very vivid, but he could tell that there was some sort of object that was producing a faint glow that was moving out there on the horizon. So he, in addition to the radar, also had visual on a few instances, along with, of course, the more notable observation up close of the quote-unquote tic-tac that Commander Fravor gives us. So, again, with the data that we have, with all of the eyewitness testimony, to me, it doesn't sound like, well, they were just looking at a 747 because, again, they would have been able to detect the transponder and they would have known if it were a conventional aircraft on that advanced radar system. What they describe instead is something that, to me, would require many separate innovations technologically that would have to have occurred over the last several decades in order to have an aircraft that is capable of moving about that quickly and yet with no wings, with no propulsion system. It produces no heat. I mean, it by all means appears to defy physics as we know it. And so to me, I can't say that's alien, but I can tell you this. It is unlike any known technology that we here on Earth currently possess. And I mean we as in you and I, the United States, Russia, China, we can't account for that technology. Now, it's a leap in judgment to say extraterrestrial.
Right.
But we should note the significance of this highly advanced technology, whatever it is and wherever it's from.
Yeah, so, right. I mean, what you just said is perfect, and it's kind of like how we set this whole thing up.
Learn more at abracast.com. Get bonus content by signing up for the mailing list. Get all that plus many exclusive episodes by supporting the show at patreon.com or subscribestar.com.
Okay, so we're going to move past this extraterrestrial hypothesis in 1 second. I just want to ask you, because obviously you know your business, you know what you're talking about. If I asked you what the strongest evidence was, or what do you perceive as the strongest evidence of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, like if you have like a pet, like a pet piece of evidence, would you have something like that?
Not really. I mean, that's the frustrating thing about UFOs. Science, and this is one of the reasons why, much to the annoyance of UFO researchers over the years, I mean, there have been some very good UFO researchers who are pro-UFO, and it's not wrong, and I'm sure that some skeptics would have their feathers ruffled by hearing me say this, but again, I hope they understand where I'm coming from. It's not wrong to advocate the scientific study of something that is not easily studied scientifically. UFOs are not easily studied scientifically because we do not have physical evidence which is requisite for the physicist or the chemist, or an atmospheric scientist. We want to be able to have stuff. We need to be able to have physical data. We need to be able to do experiments with it. Now, it's not to say that the scientific process can't be applied to the study of UFOs, but I think that where some skeptics do fail is that because of the lack of evidence, they feel that this is not anything worthy of scientific study. Now, I think that that's faulty logic. I think that, again, the amount of anecdotal data, and now we're starting to get, even though we still don't have that physical proof, we are starting to get some instrumental data, because let's be very clear, the 3 pieces of footage released by the Navy, which are confirmed to have provenance within the Navy, but which the Navy confirms also that they can identify the objects in those. Now, whatever that means, I'll leave that up to the minds of the listener, but I mean, they say we don't know what they are, so it seems that it is something unidentified, unusual. To me, what that indicates is, well, first of all, I should point out to my broader point, they're not just pieces of video. These are pieces of footage that are utilizing a wide array of different instrumentation to discern characteristics about the objects, including heat signatures, speed, and tracking capabilities. It's more than just somebody with a camcorder filming something and getting it on video. Right. So that's important to point out here, because thanks to this kind of technology and the sorts of innovations by the Raytheon Company, et cetera, that allow for tracking and film of these sorts of objects with their flight characteristics to be made, that goes beyond just video evidence. It's not physical proof, but it's definitely enough to indicate to us that we are dealing with something that is more than just people thinking they're seeing stuff, but it's just floaters on the surface of the eye, or meteors, the planet Venus, the conjectures of the for decades. again, I sympathize with the skeptics because I see where they're coming from. They say, we need some physical proof. Give us a shred of physical proof and we'll be right behind you. But I think that they fail to understand that maybe we are confronted here with something that is not easily studied scientifically, but that doesn't mean that the case for scientific study should be off the table. What we need to do is we have to think of the most clever ways that we can utilize technology at its current state of the art in order to gather information about these things. We may now be reaching a point where we're able to do that. So I would say if there's anything that comes close, because we don't have that physical proof, but to your question, is there anything that really is a good, solid point that can be offered in furtherance of any idea, let alone maybe the ET hypothesis? These videos are a good starting point, but they don't give us enough information to be able to base a conclusion. We can't, any conclusion at this point would be premature. We can only deal in terms of likelihoods. But I would say in terms of likelihood, the extraterrestrial hypothesis is one possibility and should not be left off the table.
Right. So if someone was asking me the question I just asked you about what I think the best proof for the extraterrestrial hypothesis would be, I think that I would be forced to at least consider the abduction phenomenon.
Sure.
Just because the stories are so similar in many cases, obviously not all of the cases, and also being someone that loves, to take weird things like this and apply psychology to them. I just think that this is one of the main things that I would have to kind of look at. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that aspect of it.
Yeah, I do. Abductions, in fact, on my show this week, which is appropriately called the Micah Hanks Program, for many years it was the Gralien Report, but that actually is a blog that I run, and there were various reasons why last year we decided to change the name, which incidentally, actually, many years ago, the original name of the show had been the Micah Hanks Program. So a lot of people were like, change it. I'm like, actually,
what's going on?
Yeah, the truth is actually, it's more like we were coming home the long way around. We came back to the original name and did what I'd always intended to do, which is have a podcast with a different name from the blog that I happen to run, which covers a lot of different news, including sci-fi stuff. So that said, the podcast, the Micah Hanks Program, my guest was Red Pill Junkie, who's a blogger and also a commentator based out of Mexico City, longtime friend of mine. And we did an episode where we talked about the abduction phenomena as it relates to shamanic practices. Now, and a lot of people would say, well, what do those two have to do with one another? But there have actually been a lot of researchers. Psychologist Kenneth Ring back in the 1990s I think he'd been with the University of Connecticut, if memory serves, but he had been one who had argued that, and I think this is really kind of his general, attitude toward the abduction phenomena. He saw a number of corollaries, psychologically speaking, between the claims of abductees and the shamanic vision quest or the journey. Many of the constant themes, you might say, are a sort of timelessness. In fact, Michael Harner, who had been, some call him a new ager, but I think he tried to distinguish as an anthropologist his advocacy for neo-shamanism. He didn't call it that. I think he had a different name for it. But, again, Michael Harner being a proponent of shamanism after being an anthropologist who studied it, at the roots of that experience among indigenous cultures, Harner had essentially said that, that's one of the aims that you attempt to achieve with, the shamanic practice is you step outside of time. There's a timelessness. There are other things too, but again, psychologists like Ring, also the late Dr. John Mack of Harvard, have noted there are a lot of consistencies between the shamanic experience and the things described by abductees, which again, within the psychological paradigm, is very interesting to me. The problem I have with abduction as it relates to, the UFO discussion, and this is kind of weird because we could even take one more step back and say, perhaps we should make a distinction between alien and extraterrestrial. And people would say, what are you even talking about? But if you think about it, let's think, what does alien actually mean? Other, unlike us, different, from a faraway place. Extraterrestrial, much more specifically, would seem to entail life not from planet Earth. And I would contend that we could have an extraterrestrial, quote unquote, alien life form, but we could also say that, an intelligence from beyond space and time, from another dimension, perhaps.
Wow.
could be called alien too, right? And so, again, I would say there could be a further distinction made between the concept of alien and extraterrestrial. Now, UFOs very well may be extraterrestrial craft. Let's say that's a possibility and put that over here for a second. But as far as the abduction phenomena, something that must be acknowledged is that while you have very interesting cases like Travis Walton, who claims that he saw an aircraft and he ran up under it, as he'll tell you very foolishly. I've met Travis many times. I've known him for years, and he's a wonderful guy. His story has always...
Fire in the Sky.
Yes, very, very same guy. And he'll tell you that film, if you've seen that film, Fire in the Sky, it's not like what happened to him. I highly recommend people read the book or watch a video where he talks about that, because that film is not an accurate representation of his experience. But Travis's experience did involve an aircraft. I won't go too much deeper into that right now. What he claims happened to him, his experience involved an aircraft. We also had a similar instance from a couple of years before that in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker also observed an aircraft. They said it was sort of like an elongated egg shape. We might call that sort of like a tic-tac. It came down. They were taken aboard this aircraft for a moment, they said, and examined by these very bizarre-looking entities. There are instances, and the point I'm making here is that UFOs do show up from time to time in claims of abductions, but not all people who claim to have those abduction-type experiences ever see a UFO. Some people say that the experiences occur in their bedrooms at night. Some, describe kind of waking up into this other sort of, event or reality. And if you really do a deep reading of that literature, you come to find very quickly that you cannot say that the UFO phenomenon, unidentified flying objects, and the claims of abductees are exclusive to one another. Often they occur very separately. So I would say perhaps there is something to the abduction phenomenon beyond a modern clinical psychological perspective, that these are dreams, sleep paralysis, things like that. Let's say that some of these experiences are deeper and that there's more to it. We could very much call that an alien experience without it having to be extraterrestrial or even related to UFOs per se. However,
that's a very good point. That's a very good point.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, again, it's I think something that's very necessary. We got to kind of break the phenomena apart so as to understand it. But some people who have had experiences with unidentified flying objects also claim to have had abductions. Now, one final point here. I don't want to ramble all night, and I can do that real well. I'm sure you can tell. But as Travis Walton will point out, he said, I don't think of my experience as an abduction. He said it was more like a rescue mission. He said, I ran up under this thing and was waving my arms because I was excited. He says, I believe it grounded, and there was an electrical arc that sprung off the base of the thing and shocked me. And if I had been left there in the woods lying on the ground, burnt to a crisp, I probably would have died. He said, I think that they brought me on board the aircraft. They made sure I was okay, and then they dropped me off. So he said,
wow.
I was not taken. It was not an abduction per se. It was more like, okay, this dummy ran under here and did this, and let's make sure he's not dead. So, and he thanks them for taking the time to take care of him like they did. But again, I would say that despite many people trying to project onto his experience, well, it's another typical claim by an abductee. No, not at all. It's very different. In fact, it's completely different almost from the majority of the abduction literature.
Yeah, the movie makes it seem a lot more uncomfortable and evasive than just patching them up and sending them back home.
Right, yeah, the film it was a horror movie,
Yeah, it was. Okay, so, all right, so, if we've spoken a lot about this extraterrestrial hypothesis, and I kind of want to move past that. Mm-hmm. So, what is your go-to other hypothesis? Because I know there is a lot out there, and I don't want to necessarily make you go through every single one of them. So, what are your kind of go-tos of the alternative hypothesis?
Well, I guess to answer that question, we'd have to go through a few of them, but I promise to be brief. I mean, to understand the UFO phenomenon, I think first requires understanding the things that can be discerned, natural or otherwise, that people often observe and mistake for being something unexplainable. And, there was some really important work that I think significantly was first carried out by Alan Hendry, who was I think he had a bachelor's degree in physics, and he was a commercial artist. His wife actually, I think, had a PhD in physics. But Alan Hendry worked full-time for a couple of years at the Center for UFO Studies under J. Allen Hynek. And of course, Hynek, of course, being the former Air Force advisor to the well, he wasn't with the Air Force, but he was the advisor to the Air Force during the Blue Book years. Initially a skeptic, he was the one who famously offered the idea of swamp gas, after and people never let him live that down. He referred to the writings of Charles Fort, which again, if we jump back over to earlier when we discussed pre-ufology, you might say that there were definitely ideas that later would become the norm in modern post-1947 UFO research and writing that were anticipated by writers like Charles Fort, and as early as the 1910s and 20s in his books like Book of the Damned, Lo, New Lands, Charles Hoy Fort, for whom Fortean phenomena is named. I mean, he was writing about unusual phenomena in the sky. He was hypothesizing about visitors and airships from other worlds. So although that's pre-ufology, he very much anticipated a lot of the trends, and in truth, probably colored the way that people after the 1947 events that made UFOs a household, flying saucers more so a household world. UFO didn't come into usage until the eve of Project Blue Book. Edward Ruppelt actually coined that term UFO. He said it should be said as UFO. And he said, again, that's because not all these things are flying discs or saucers. We need a more ambiguous term. So, but, again, the idea had been anticipated by Fort and then also some of his followers, including Vincent Gaddis. And I really do need to interject here, too. Vincent Gaddis, in the 1947, I think it was maybe the May issue of Amazing Stories magazine, had a fascinating article called Visitors from the Void. And this is a good month before Kenneth Arnold's sighting over Mount Rainier, and yet he's writing about mystery airplanes and strange things in the sky, strange sounds coming from the sky. The reason I point this out is because it's an article about UFOs that was published in a month and therefore probably written several months before Kenneth Arnold's first sighting of UFOs. The same issue actually features this long, drawn-out story, which is by this guy named Richard Sharp Shaver. And the editor of the magazine had really had to clean this story up. I think Shaver's original contribution had been something like 40,000 words, and it was called A Warning to Future Humankind. And the editor of Amazing Stories, Ray Palmer, edits this down and makes it into a workable story and calls it I Remember Lemuria. And the story is about this underground race of beings and this kind of conflict between these good guys and then the evil underground race, which are called the Darrows or the detrimental robots. But this becomes known as the Shaver mystery. And this is actually one of these alternative hypotheses, John. It had been Ray Palmer's contention that Shaver might not be crazy, that maybe the UFOs actually were coming from underground, that they were a quote-unquote crypto-terrestrial civilization, that they were a civilization that existed right here on Earth. And even though that's far from likely, it's certainly something that a few people over the years have continued to entertain. What if this is some sort of technology that someone or something right here on Earth is operating? So that would be one. Now, my favored, but again, it's important, I think, to point that out because that idea sort of preceded the UFO phenomena as we know it today. So you might say that right from the outset there were these alternative hypotheses. Historically speaking, one of my favorites is, I guess, what you would call the Valléan or the Magonian sort of hypothesis. When Jacques Vallée started, again, French, physicist, astronomer, and UFO researcher, when Vallée started looking at UFOs, and he was publishing on them actually in the 1960s, I mean, he first approached this, like everybody else, from the likelihood that this was a extraterrestrial phenomenon, and he was utilizing early computer science to try and study it in that capacity. Yes. Yeah. Again, just to kind of be brief, Vallée starts off looking at this from the UFO angle as far as the idea that these are extraterrestrial, and he's using early computer science to try and assess the phenomenon in that regard. And before long, he begins to realize, if we're studying this phenomenon and we're assuming these are extraterrestrial, you'd think that we would be making some significant headway, and yet we seem to be further and further almost from the phenomenon. He, like a lot of people, began to become really dissatisfied with that ET hypothesis. And so with the publication of his book, Passport to Magonia, I think that's when he really, kind of defines his alternative take on this, which is we need to look at this phenomena as though, when we look back to folklore and we look at, the fairy folklore, of Europe and we look at, traditions from around the world with relation to, spiritual beliefs and things like this. There are definitely corollaries. There's continuity between those older belief systems and traditions and this modern phenomenon. Now, a lot of people, I think, saw Passport to Magonia as being nonsense because they're like, so you're saying fairies and aliens, are the same thing? This is poppycock valet. Valet, I think a lot of people who really liked the idea were like, and therefore you think it's interdimensional.
Right.
Ballet, if anything, was famously and perhaps intentionally ambiguous. And so your question is, what would be my favorite alternative hypothesis? And actually, I have to say that I love the ambiguity of Valet's approach. I think it's what a good scientist does. They say, look, here are some things we should consider. But quite obviously, we do not know what this is yet. And therefore, this phenomena should be studied, and yet we should try not to leap to conclusions about what it may be while we're studying it, which is a really hard thing to do. So I don't know what you would call his hypothesis. Some people try to call it the dimensional hypothesis or whatever. Many infer that he believes that this is probably some sort of temporal phenomena. They may be time travelers or something like that. To me, maybe it's all those things and none of those things, but really a better name for it would be like the Magonian hypothesis, which is essentially this. Let's acknowledge there's some weird stuff going on without saying we think we know what it is, right? So
yeah, well,
that's kind of where I am.
It almost kind of fits into kind of what we were talking about earlier. Maybe restating it, it's, this idea that once our culture might move from like a mythological framework to like a religious framework, and then now to like a science framework, the way we perceive the phenomenon goes from, fairies or to angels or demons and now to maybe UFOs. Maybe it's a problem with the way we perceive it.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing too is that, here's the thing. I don't think that all UFOs, all things that people claim that they see and call UFOs, are the same phenomenon. Okay, so let's break that down. I think people see a lot of different things that they can't identify. But I think that all those things, if we actually could somehow magically find out what they are, well, let's say scientifically, let's say that we have this incredible scientific tool that is able to go back through these reports and we can definitively, identify everything that people claim that they see. And some of these things are actually unidentifiable. My contention would be that if we could do that, whatever we are left with, there would be all different kinds of things that people are seeing, right? And so, again, I've had skeptics who kind of lead with the presumption, even when I'm talking about this, they've come after me and been like, well, presuming he thinks these are all one thing. And I'm like, no, I don't presume that. And I've never said that. Right. I think that I don't profess to know or to even guess, what the quote unquote broader phenomenon is. I had this dialogue, John, with an editor a number of years ago, kind of about this. And he says, well, that's all well and good, but Micah, you're wasting your time because at the end of the day, you're not proving that there are, alien spaceships here. And I'm like, is our job to try and prove that they are something that we are only guessing they might be? Yes, at times with science, you have to have a hypothesis. Okay. But a hypothesis is an educated guess. And, again, in fairness, many UFO advocates would say, but the extraterrestrial hypothesis is an educated guess, Micah. Yes, it is, but it is not necessarily the be-all, end-all answer. It is not necessarily a resolution to the problem of UFOs. And I think you'd agree, John. I think we're dealing with a problem. We're beginning to gather some very compelling data about it, but we've been gathering data, for what that's worth, for decades now. And in truth, if we do look back to earlier times, we can incorporate certain unusual things seen in the skies into that body of data too, but that has more relation to psychology, like you were saying, and what the human mind does when it sees things that it can't identify. And taking all these things into consideration, we've been collecting a lot of data, but we are very far from determining what the source or sources of these experiences are. And so I think in many ways, the valet approach is kind of the best. A lot of these things are prosaic, they're celestial phenomena. Sometimes they're spy planes, seen flying at high altitude and reflecting sunlight at dusk. I mean, sometimes they're experimental aircraft that are far beyond what we know to exist, but which our government's been, dabbling with for decades. Sometimes maybe there's something more too, and we can't identify what that something more is. But I mean, with all these possibilities on the table, at the end of the day, we are left with the lens of reality that humans see the world through. And that's where psychology has to come into this.
Yeah, and sometimes they're time traveling AI robots from a breakaway civilization from Antarctica. I mean, not to intentionally make fun of those kind of theories, but I mean, those are kind of the theories that are out there, right? Like that they're AI, or that they're time travelers from like a distant future coming back to, I don't know, do like scientific testing and stuff like that. And that stuff just fascinates me listening to that. Do you have any thoughts on those kind of things?
Well, I do. And, and I wouldn't mind if you did make fun of those things. I make fun of those ideas too. I think when it comes to the UFO topic, I try to be, serious. I try to be conscientious, and I try to be collegial, with my other researchers, and I try to engage in meaningful dialogue, but I also try to be at times an equal opportunity offender in the sense that I just, I'm going to make fun of all these hypotheses and laugh in your face, because at the end of the day, we don't really know what these things are. And when I'm more likely to make fun of things is when I see people getting married to pet theories. We need to not really get married to ideas at this point, but case in point, I wrote a book a few years ago called The UFO Singularity, where I actually proposed that we should consider artificial intelligence and not so much time travel, but what I called atemporal phenomenon in relation to the UFO issue. And more fundamental to that argument had been this, if I were to summarize that book very briefly, it would be this, UFOs, if they are something in terms of a technology from someplace else, some other physical location in the universe. Our astrobiologists, our astronomers, our physicists, they've been looking for alien life and they're not seeing very much evidence of it. Right. What that seems to mean is not necessarily that it isn't out there, but that it is far away enough that we aren't able to detect such things as technosignatures. In other words, easily discernible signatures that are evidence of technologically advanced civilizations on distant planets, things like this. We don't see evidence of their attempts at trying to contact us. If they are doing so, perhaps our own technology, our METI to their SETI, if they're engaged in similar search for extraterrestrial intelligence to what we here on Earth are doing, maybe they are engaging in that, but we don't have advanced or sophisticated enough technologies to receive the messages that they're sending. For whatever reason, there may be life out there and even intelligent life, but we haven't found it yet, which primarily suggests one thing to me. And that is they're far enough away that, we are not equipped to be able to discern where they are. Not that they don't exist. I think in likelihood life does exist, but if they're that far away, the next thing we should probably infer is that if they're biological and they're anything like us, then it's going to be difficult for them as biological organisms to travel that great a distance to get here and visit us. Now, if UFOs are anything more than prosaic phenomena, misidentification, psychological phenomena, all this sort of stuff, there are a lot of different ways to interpret that, and we can interpret it outside the interpretation that they are flesh and blood and that they're flying across space like, many great UFO researchers have advocated over the years. I just don't think that that's likely. Sure, we could talk about wormholes, we could talk about time travel, we can talk about all that junk, but to my way of thinking, one easy way to get around all of that is, hey, if they aren't biological EBEs, extraterrestrial biological entities, if they were artificial intelligence and they were piloting some sort of sophisticated craft that can get over the hurdles of being able to, provide enough fuel to be able to traverse distances that great,
Right.
You know, you immediately overcome a lot of the hurdles that biology would face. So again, my contention had been with the book, maybe we should consider artificial intelligence in relation to the UFO phenomenon. However, the next step I made beyond that is, you know, human perception of time is a funny thing. And Stephen Hawking wrote about this in his book, A Brief History of Time. He talked about the thermodynamic arrow of time. I've talked about this a lot in a lot of interviews. And John, if you've heard me talk about this, I apologize in advance. But
no, please lay it on me. Yeah.
If I'm being redundant, yeah. But, you know, the thermodynamic arrow of time, there are several different ones. You know, the cosmological arrow of time. You know, there's the one in relation to thermodynamic laws and entropy. But essentially what Hawking is arguing in the book is that, you know, memory, human memory, works in the same direction that entropy increases. What are we talking about when we discuss entropy in relation to thermodynamic laws? A very simple example, and the one that he gives in the book, is if you've got a glass on the edge of a table and you reach over to grab a pen and you knock the glass off the table and it goes and it, you know, hits the ground and shatters into a million pieces, you're going to have a real hard time putting that glass back together. You might be able to sit there and painstakingly glue every piece back together, but it's still going to be a bunch of fractured portions glued together. You can't reassemble it into the state it was originally in. You can't crack the egg and magically reassemble it into the egg again. You know, the egg once cracked is forever broken. Hawking was saying, you know, there's a thermodynamic arrow of time. Entropy is that trend toward chaos, and once you move in that direction, you don't go back, right? And he said human memory works in the same way, that we can remember the past. We remember the past because, again, the direction or the thermodynamic arrow in which entropy increases. But he says in a block universe, even if the future exists, the human mind is limited to the present. We can't see that future, right? And he says that all has to do with these properties of entropy. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, we're on the cusp of creating nearly perfect efficiency in terms of microcomponents in computers and computation. If we had an artificial intelligence sophisticated enough and utilizing such efficient components at some point in the future, let's say, that computer intelligence was not as beholden to the laws of entropy as we are. And many would say, well, that's impossible in this universe. But again, even if they can't completely overcome entropy, I think Schrodinger, I believe it was Schrodinger, who speculated about negentropy, you know, and the conditions under which microbial life might actually be able to operate in absence of entropy on a planet of a certain size with a certain kind of gravity. He had all these parameters. But again, the point I'm making is, if a computer intelligence could operate differently in relation to entropy than we would they be able to perceive time differently too? So the next question we have to consider too in relation to artificial intelligence, if they could make it here, if they can travel so fast that, again, relativity comes into question and they're traversing great distances and time comes into question there too, but maybe they perceive time differently as well. Maybe we should consider not only artificial intelligence, but an atemporal form of intelligence in relation to any hypothetical visitors to Earth from elsewhere, UFOs or otherwise. So that was my idea, and those are my general thoughts on those subjects.
Yeah, the way that you describe the AI, though, it sounds like almost a Kurzweilian, like spiritual sort of entity being able to step outside of time and examine, you know, all these possibilities and stuff. Like I just think that is really a fascinating idea.
That's cool that you mentioned that because, when I again, the UFO Singularity, I don't really tell people of all the books I've written, and it's still in print. You can actually still get it. But of all the books I've written on this topic, I don't tell people run out and buy that book. It was an essay. You know, it was a lengthy essay in book form. It was a thought experiment. The problem with writing books like that is people go read it and they go, and this is what Hanks believes about UFOs.
Right.
First of all, leave belief out of it. And no, that's not my final word on I had a guy write me a while back and say, you know, you're as wrong about this as anything you've ever said on your podcast. You know, your idea about the UFO phenomena is just nuts. And I'm like, no, that's not what that book is. You know, and I think it's okay to say, again, the late Mac Tonnies, who was a researcher a number of years ago, the last book, very sadly, that he wrote, although it was a great book, was called the cryptoterrestrials. He goes back sort of to that idea of like what we talked about with the Shaver mystery. He said, what if there was something right here in our midst that could account for this UFO thing? But and the beautiful thing about Mac is he put that idea out there, but that wasn't the sum total of his years of research. It wasn't his conclusion. It was a thought experiment. Sometimes I think in order to really exercise our mental musculature, we have to kind of, step outside the framework of reality that we're agreeing to work in and say, let's play what if for a little while. I think occultists and magicians, and alchemists and psychologists and shaman and certain particle physicists today. I mean, I think throughout time, lots of people from lots of different disciplines have engaged in that sort of creative faculty of the mind, that dreamlike experience of, hey, let's step outside reality and just see what the hell happens. That's maybe sometimes where good ideas come from, right? So, let's speculate and not necessarily get married to those ideas.
Yeah, I think that's wise. Like, I always think of, you have to become uncomfortable to get around certain things, especially, as you say, if you're married to them as a belief. And, not to keep banging on these kind of things, but that's why safe spaces is such an awful idea for a college campus. You have to be kind of shaken up a little bit to kind of receive new information.
You do. You want to get scary for a minute? Can we get scary?
Sure.
And this is unrelated to UFOs, but there's this big brouhaha going on. And again, I'm going to touch on some things that have to do with politics right now, but these aren't endorsements, and this isn't anything I'm not doing anything more than just observing what's happening in the world right now. Okay.
Right.
But the other day, the podcaster Joe Rogan, I've listened to Joe over the years, and I love a lot of the shows he does, and I enjoy a lot of the interviews, and I think he's a cool guy. I'd love to meet Joe and get to know him. Joe had Bernie Sanders on his program, and they did an hour. It was some of his shows are like 4 and 5 hours long, and Bernie Sanders does an hour, right? Because he's Bernie, and Bernie, he only does an hour. And after that, a few months after that, I guess, Joe says, if I had to vote for anybody in this election, I'll probably vote for Bernie. And so the Sanders campaign thought, well, that's cool. We're gonna take that, and we're gonna say, okay, Joe has said he'll probably vote for us, and so they, use that as a sort of endorsement, which I don't think is unfair. But again, Joe didn't come out and go, I endorse Bernie Sanders in 2020. He just said he's probably the guy I'd vote for. Well, when Sanders and the campaign come out and say, yeah, we're going to, play up the fact that Joe has said this, you start seeing all these attacks in the media. And there's an article at CNN that is accusing Joe Rogan of having a history of racist and homophobic, commentary and things along these lines.
Oh, boy, yeah.
To what you'd been touching on. That's why I bring this up. But here's where it gets scary, John. I mean, Joe's like, first of all, I'm a comedian. I love everybody. I'm not a homophobe at all. I'm not racist. But, I make jokes, which actually, to my knowledge, he's never made any kind of joke that could even be construed as racist or homophobic. But somehow CNN infers this, and then they tweet his history of racist, homophobic, and transphobic comments. And I'm thinking, we say so much about fake news these days, and yet here is a major media agency fabricating a story about Joe Rogan. So Joe, did he lose his mind? No, he goes on his show and says, it's not fair what they're saying, and it's not true. And he feels like he has to defend himself. And the saddest part about it is, it's not that they had anything against Joe Rogan. It's that they felt they had to make him look bad because they knew what that would do to Bernie Sanders. Right. So the point I'm making, and again, dear listeners at home, this isn't about politics. This is about the bizarro alternate reality that exists when you have an agenda that you need to drive home, and you can make anything true that you need to. And think about that when we're talking about, the UFO phenomenon or anything else. I mean, I'm not saying reality is really pliable, but depending on where you get your information, it can be made to seem that way. And so there was this great article at Psychology Today the other day that was saying that, some members of the media are trying to gaslight you about Joe Rogan. I wasn't familiar with this expression, but gaslighting, as the article outlines, is essentially utilizing bits and pieces of information to create a counter narrative that may not be true, but their intention is to convince you of its truthfulness. And, again, this is, many would say that in UFO talk that, this has been something the government and others, other agencies have tried to do for decades, but I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to this epistemological question in relation to philosophy. How do we know what we know?
Yeah.
And what do we know?
It's funny. Yeah, it's funny. It's like, here on my show, like, you're not going to offend anybody. Like we used to spend a lot more time talking about, how the media shapes narrative. Like I have a multi-part, series on, media creating culture and fake, quote, fake news, unquote. So I just want you to be comfortable. Like everyone's going to understand what, what you're talking about here.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I could glean from, the shows of yours that I've listened to that, you guys have talked about that a good bit. And again, kudos to you, because I mean, it's a weird problem these days where there is this, I mean, it's great that anyone can do a podcast and that, anyone can have a voice, but the media also is the mainstream media. Not that they're bad by any means, but again, people who are, quote unquote, trained journalists, and specialists and experts in reporting and other kinds of commentary, they realize it's like, the sort of control mechanism that we once had, the filtration mechanism that we once had, is no longer ours. And now we have to try and, claim our stake, which is going to have to remain. This is not just news like you'd get anywhere on the web. This is your especially curated, truth-approved version of reality, right? And that's not always the case. That's the big takeaway. The media, which was once, looked to as an authority by virtue of their ability to curate and to vet sources and details and to report accurately and in an unbiased way, that all went out the window at some point. Right.
Yeah. Well, when you start seeing, media quoting Twitter, some Twitter account as news, like you're like, well, hold on, wait a minute, who is the Twitter? Like, it's just, like it gets silly when you put it under a microscope.
Well, it does, yeah. And I'll tell you what the deal with quoting Twitter is. That's what we call a filler piece. That's easy. It's like, let's look at all the stuff people are saying on Twitter, and then we embed those in the post. Count the actual word count of the article. It's going to be like 250 words, but they can fill a whole page of web space with all the embedded tweets that prove their point, which, oh yes, fantastic job curating reality today, folks, at name your news agency there by embedding people's random inflammatory tweets from around the world. Again, but that's the whole thing, is what seems to be driving the media, and maybe more broadly, we should say culture these days, as the web relates to things, is, you hear that expression, clickbait. People are incentivized not to tell the truth. They are incentivized to get your attention. And so you see more confrontationalism and more, bombast, and you see more, overall craziness by what were once very venerable, news outlets, because they know if they can create a compelling and controversial news headline, they're going to get your attention. But now it seems to be going beyond just the headlines. And now the actual reporting is also becoming more bombastic and frankly, at times, a lot more subjective. By more subjective, I mean probably less truthful. But they're making money, they're getting those clicks, they're getting their AdSense clicks. So, but we have to recognize that's what's driving so much of the media these days. They're trying to struggle to remain relevant and to get everybody's attention, just like anybody else who owns a blog or has a Facebook or a Twitter account.
Yep. Yeah. Hey, so before I let you go, I was wondering if, I really haven't heard you talk about this much. I could have just missed it, but I was wondering how you got involved in all this weird stuff. Were you
Yeah.
like a in search of kid, or?
Yeah, I was. Definitely watched all that stuff. When I was growing up, I loved reading books about Sasquatch, and cryptozoology is really my first love. And, I had a conversation with a journalist a while back, Keith Clore, who, Clore's kind of controversial. And he's also got a hard edge, but, I like Keith, and, he gets a lot of guff because he wrote an article for The Intercept, which was questioning the role, the title, and some of the claims of one Lou Elizondo, the alleged former head of ATIP. But I got to tell you, thanks in part to the diligence of the reporting of Tim McMillan, my friend who I mentioned earlier, and some limited interactions with Lou myself, which really are only just beginning. But I think that at this point there is the paper trail has been established, and I'm comfortable saying, although I was cautious at first, mind you, I'm comfortable now saying I think Lou is exactly who he said he was, and he is attempting to do exactly what he says he's trying to do. He and Chris Mellon, and I hope now that maybe the UFO community, after that vetting process is nearing completion, maybe not quite there, but again, I credit Tim McMillan for so much of that. I hope maybe we can move beyond that. But the reason I mention it is because, I was talking with Keith Clore, who really kind of led that charge in the article he did for The Intercept. And this wasn't an interview or anything. This was just he and I chatting on the phone. And he, of course, before we talked, had jumped online and read some articles and things I'd written about topics like Sasquatch. And he goes, "Oh, you don't believe in that, do you? You don't believe in Bigfoot now, do you?" He's just kind of ribbing me. That's what Keith is. I said, "Keith, here's the thing." And I said, "You used to write for the Anthropological Society of America." And I said, any anthropologist, if there were a shred of evidence that suggested that Sasquatch were a real thing, any anthropologist would and should take interest in that. That would be the greatest anthropological discovery of all time. And he said, "Oh, yeah, okay, I get it." And I said, "But that's the thing, is people look at Bigfoot like it's some mystical creature. I mean, if it were to exist, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about if it existed, maybe it does. Maybe it did. I don't know. But if, when we talk about that topic, this is taken to be a anthropoid ape that is not human, Homo sapiens sapiens as we know it, but nonetheless, which is said to exist in remote portions of the world. And again, anthropologically or otherwise, that should be something that's really interesting. For me, I think it was comfort food as a kid growing up. I just thought it was really neat. And, as time goes on and you really think more critically about things, I'm not someone who would say, I think that creature's out there, I believe it exists, but I think unlike a lot of people who append their own stereotype to it, mythical creature, nonsense and silliness, legend, if you actually read the literature, I don't know that I come away from that saying this thing exists, but, as a grown-up, looking back on all the books that I read as a child, I'm like, if this thing existed, it would be significant, and that alone should be enough to cause us to want to look at that or any other mystery in the world and say, let's think about this. Let's apply critical thinking. Let's be skeptical if we need to be, but let's not rule out all possibilities, throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, yeah, I was an In Search Of kid. I watched all those shows, read all those books. I take it all with a grain of salt, but you know what? I'm still fascinated by all that stuff.
Yeah, me too, man. I grew up watching In Search Of and reading the Time Life Mysteries of the Universe books and all that stuff. So,
right, yeah,
I'm right there with you. So, all right, Micah. Well, hey, the name of your show is the Micah Hanks Program. Your website is the Gralien Report.
Yeah, and actually,
is there anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I would just put out micahhanks.com is really where you can find everything. The Gralien Report, the blog, is still in operation. All the new episodes of the Micah Hanks Program go up there, as well as articles. A lot of people, I'm sure, are wondering, it's like, why change the name of your show if you're going to keep the Gralien site? But long before there was ever a Micah Hanks Program, or any of the other podcasts I do, I produce 3 right now, there was a blog, called the Gralien Report. That really was sort of my entry into all this. I'd written a few articles for magazines and things, but at that point I was kind of thinking, that's where this is going. It's all going to the web. And so I started a blog. After all these years, it's gone through many different iterations, but it's still there. But yeah, if you want to find all of the podcasts that I produce and everything else that I'm doing these days, really the best place online to find them all in one location is micahhanks.com.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much again, Micah, for taking so much of your time out to talk to me about this stuff. And I had a great time, and I hope you did as well.
I certainly did, my man. And look, let's do it again. Don't be a stranger. I hope we can continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Micah.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Send an email or visit us on social media to let us know what you think about this topic. And please remember to leave a 5-star rate and review.